It began the way forbidden stories always do, quietly, like a spark no one notices until it's too late to stop the fire. She was the daughter of a decorated police officer, raised in a world of rules, duty, and reputation. He was a biker, tattooed, reckless in appearance, and carrying a past that most would rather forget. When their paths crossed, it wasn't supposed to mean anything. But sometimes, the heart finds home in the most unexpected places. And when it did, it ignited a storm that neither of them could escape. Her father saw it first, a change in her eyes, a softness when she spoke of someone she'd met. But when he discovered who that someone was, everything inside him turned cold. A member of the Hells Angels. The very kind of man he'd spent his life fighting against. To him, it wasn't love, it was betrayal. He forbade her from seeing him again, warning that the world she was stepping into would destroy her. Yet, love has a way of defying logic. The more he tried to keep them apart, the closer they became. The biker wasn't like the stories her father told. He wasn't cruel or violent. He was quiet, protective, haunted. He worked at a small garage on the edge of town, fixing engines by day and riding under the stars by night. There was something broken in him, something she recognized because she too had grown tired of living a life that wasn't really hers. In him, she saw freedom. In her, he saw the one thing he thought he'd lost forever: hope. But love between two worlds built on hatred cannot remain hidden for long. One night, as rain poured and thunder rolled, her father followed her. When he saw her in the arms of the biker, rage took over. Words turned to shouts, shouts to threats, and before long, the police were involved. The Hells Angels were called out by name, accused of corrupting a young woman's life. The entire town took sides, half whispering about sin, the other half whispering about courage. What happened next silenced everyone. Because when the Hells Angels showed up at her father's doorstep, they didn't come to fight. They didn't come to threaten. They came to show him something he never expected to see: respect. And what they did that night would forever change the way people looked at them, at love, and at what it truly means to protect your own. The night after the confrontation, the small town buzzed with gossip. Every diner booth, every corner store, every late-night radio host whispered the same question: what would happen next? The daughter stayed locked in her room, her heart torn between the man she loved and the father she adored. Her father, a man of iron principles and an unbending sense of justice, sat at the kitchen table, his badge glinting under the dim light. He wasn't just angry, he was afraid, not of the bikers, but of losing his daughter to the very world he had sworn to keep her safe from. On the other side of town, the biker, whose name was Luke, sat alone in the garage. His hands, calloused and blackened with grease, trembled slightly as he stared at a small photograph she had given him. In her smile, he saw everything pure in a world that had turned hard and cold. He knew what it meant to be judged before being known, to be hated for the patch on his back rather than the heart at his chest. But this time, it wasn't about pride, it was about love. And love, he decided, was worth the risk. That evening, as the rain began again, headlights cut through the darkness outside Luke's garage. One by one, motorcycles rolled in, the sound of engines rumbling like distant thunder. The Hells Angels had arrived, not as outlaws on a mission, but as brothers protecting one of their own. Their leader, a man known only as Mason, dismounted and looked at Luke with quiet understanding. "You love her?" Mason asked. Luke didn't hesitate. "More than my own life." Mason nodded once, his voice low but steady. "Then we do this the right way." The next morning, Mason and a few members rode to the police station. The entire town froze as they parked their bikes outside. Officers tensed, hands twitching near their holsters. But the Angels didn't come in violence. They came with peace. Mason walked up to the chief, the girl's father, and said, "You think we're monsters. But if a man loves your daughter, he'll prove it not with words, but with honor." The chief didn't answer, but his silence said everything. He was listening, though he didn't want to admit it. Later that day, Luke received a message to meet the chief at the edge of town. When he arrived, the air was thick with tension. The chief's voice was cold but controlled. "You want to be with her?" he asked. Luke nodded. "Then prove you're not like the rest." Luke didn't ask how. He only said, "Tell me what to do." The chief stared at him for a long moment before replying, "Protect what's mine." and maybe I'll believe you. Luke didn't know what that meant yet, but he would soon find out. A few days later, the police received a tip about a gang of drug traffickers moving through the outskirts of town. It was dangerous work, the kind of job that had taken more than one good cop down. The chief gathered his men, but was short on backup. To everyone's shock, Luke and a few of the Hells Angels showed up at the edge of the operation, unarmed and ready to help. You said to protect what's yours, Luke told him. And this town, that's hers. The chief wanted to refuse, but something in Luke's eyes stopped him. There was no arrogance, no defiance, just determination. The bikers knew the terrain better than any patrol unit. They positioned themselves strategically, using their experience on the road to cut off the traffickers' escape. When a fight broke out, it wasn't the police who reached the danger first. It was the Hells Angels. Luke tackled one of the men who had drawn a weapon on the chief, taking a hard blow to the ribs, but saving his life in the process. By the time it was over, the traffickers were in custody, the evidence was secured, and the chief stood staring at the man he had once called a criminal. Luke was bruised, bleeding, and smiling through the pain. "Told you," he said quietly. "I protect what's hers." The chief didn't speak. He just nodded once and said, "Get that cut cleaned up." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. When the story hit the news, everything changed. The same people who had once whispered hatred now whispered disbelief. The headlines read, "Hells Angels help police foil major crime operation." For the first time, the town saw them not as threats, but as men capable of honor. Luke didn't care about the attention, but the girl, his girl, watched with tears in her eyes. For the first time, her father's world and her lover's world had collided, not in chaos, but in courage. That night, as she visited Luke at the garage, she said softly, "He doesn't hate you anymore." Luke smiled faintly. "No," he said, "he just doesn't know how to stop." They both laughed, the kind of laughter that comes when pain starts turning into peace. Outside, the faint sound of motorcycles filled the night like a heartbeat, steady, strong, and full of promise. In the following days, the tension in the town began to shift. People who once crossed the street to avoid the Angels now nodded when they rode by. The chief still didn't speak much to Luke, but his silence no longer carried hatred. It carried thought. Something inside him was changing, though he fought hard not to show it. He had spent his entire life drawing lines between good and bad, law and crime, right and wrong. But now, those lines were beginning to blur, and in that gray space, he was forced to confront a truth he never wanted to see. Not all angels have wings, and not all men with badges are pure. Luke continued to visit the girl secretly, though the secrecy felt less forbidden now and more sacred. They didn't speak much of the past. Instead, they talked about the future, the kind of life they both wanted but didn't dare to believe they could have. He dreamed of leaving the chaos of the road behind, of starting a small garage of his own. She dreamed of a peace that didn't come with guilt. When they were together, the world stopped being about sides. It was just about them. One evening, as the sun fell behind the mountains, Luke's crew gathered outside the garage. Mason, the leader, stood quietly, lighting a cigarette. "You know, kid," he said, "most of us never get a shot at redemption. You did. Don't waste it." Luke nodded, the weight of those words settling deep in his chest. The Angels had saved him once, not from death, but from meaninglessness. And now, somehow, he was saving them in return by showing the world what loyalty really looked like. That night, the chief came to the garage unannounced. The sound of his car door slamming made everyone freeze. Luke wiped his hands, heart pounding. The chief looked around, his eyes scanning the motorcycles lined up like an army. "I came to talk," he said. Mason gestured for his men to step back. The chief walked closer to Luke. "My daughter. She says you make her happy." Luke nodded, unsure what to say. "You saved my life," the chief continued. "But I need to know something. Will you protect hers?" Luke's voice didn't shake. "With mine." The chief didn't answer right away. He simply looked at Luke, the same way a father looks at a man who might one day hold his daughter's heart. After a long silence, he extended his hand. Luke hesitated, then shook it. It wasn't approval, not yet, but it was the beginning of respect. In that handshake, decades of rivalry between law and rebellion quietly cracked, making space for something new, understanding. News of the unlikely alliance spread fast. The entire town buzzed again, this time with awe rather than judgment. The local paper called it the day the badge and the patch shook hands. For the chief, the story was a bitter pill. He had built his reputation on discipline and control, yet the men who lived outside his rules had proven something he never could. That loyalty wasn't born from fear, it was born from love. As days passed, the Hells Angels began working with the police on community projects. They helped clean up old neighborhoods, fix broken houses, and donate to families in need. It was a sight no one thought they'd ever see. Men in leather jackets working beside men in uniform, laughing, sweating, building something bigger than both of them. The chief didn't say it out loud, but he was proud. And though he'd never admit it, part of him admired the courage it took for those men to change the way the world saw them. But peace, as they all knew, never lasts without being tested. One afternoon, while the crew was working at the edge of town, a rival biker gang arrived. They had heard about Luke's connection with the police and saw it as betrayal. Words turned into threats and soon into violence. By the time the chief arrived with his officers, chaos had already erupted. Engines roaring, fists flying, the air thick with tension and dust. The chief jumped into the middle of the fight, shouting for everyone to stop. But it wasn't his badge that silenced the crowd. It was Luke. Standing bloodied but unbroken, he shouted, "This isn't about gangs. This is about my family, both of them." The words hit like a hammer. Slowly, the shouting faded, and one by one, the bikers lowered their fists. The chief helped Luke to his feet, his hand steady on the man's shoulder. "You did good, son," he said quietly. Luke looked up in disbelief. It was the first time the chief had ever called him that. That night, the girl sat with her father on the porch, her head resting on his shoulder. "You were wrong about him," she said gently. The chief nodded, watching the horizon. "No," he replied, his voice low. "I was wrong about a lot of things." The rumble of motorcycles echoed softly in the distance, not as a threat, but as a promise, a sound that no longer meant fear, but family. Weeks passed, and the town settled into an uneasy but beautiful balance. The sight of motorcycles parked beside police cruisers became strangely normal. It wasn't peace born of law. It was peace born of understanding. Luke kept working at the garage, fixing bikes by day and visiting the chief's home by night. The once suspicious glances from neighbors turned into quiet nods of respect. People had stopped asking if the love between the cop's daughter and the biker could last. Now they just watched it grow. The chief, though still reserved, began to see what his daughter saw. Luke didn't wear his loyalty on his jacket. He lived it. One night, after dinner, the chief sat across from Luke in the living room. "You know," he said, staring into his coffee, "I used to think men like you didn't change." Luke smiled softly. "I used to think men like you couldn't forgive." The room fell silent. Then the chief let out a low chuckle. "Looks like we were both wrong." That moment marked something unspoken, a bridge that no badge or brotherhood could have built on its own. The town's annual parade arrived, a tradition that celebrated the police department service. But this year, something unexpected happened. The chief invited the Hells Angels to ride in the procession. When their engines roared to life beside the police sirens, the crowd didn't jeer or whisper. They clapped. Children waved flags. Old men tipped their hats, and the air filled with something almost holy, redemption. For once, the sound of thunder on two wheels meant unity, not rebellion. After the parade, Luke stood beside the chief watching the sunset. "I never thought I'd see the day," the chief said. Luke nodded. "Neither did I. But maybe it takes breaking all the rules to build new ones." The chief smiled faintly. "You're starting to sound like a cop." Luke laughed. "Careful, old man. You're starting to sound like a biker." They both laughed then, two men from opposite worlds finally sharing the same horizon. That night, the chief's daughter watched them from the porch, tears in her eyes. It wasn't just that her father had accepted the man she loved. It was that he had learned to see people differently. For her, love had started as rebellion, but it had ended as revelation. She had watched hate turn to humility, fear turn to faith, and pride turn to peace. And in that transformation, she saw something far greater than romance. She saw redemption made real. As time went on, Luke and the chief's relationship deepened into something that resembled family. They didn't always agree. Sometimes they argued fiercely, but beneath every word was mutual respect. The chief had once seen the world in black and white. Now he understood that most lives, like Luke's jacket, were made of shades of gray stitched together by survival. He began to visit the garage, not to supervise, but to help, handing tools, learning how to fix engines, and even laughing with the bikers who once terrified him. One afternoon, while Luke worked beneath a car, the chief crouched beside him and said, "You ever think about marrying her?" The wrench slipped from Luke's hand. "Every day," he admitted. The chief grinned, then stopped thinking. That night, under a sky streaked with stars, Luke asked her to be his wife. Not with grand gestures or fancy words, but with the same sincerity that had carried him through every storm. Her answer was the one he had hoped for all along, a quiet, tearful yes. When news of the engagement spread, the town erupted in disbelief and celebration alike. Some called it madness, others called it destiny. But no one could deny that it felt right. The wedding was held in the same park where her father had once arrested his first criminal. This time, the only thing under guard was love itself. Rows of officers stood beside rows of bikers. Two armies once divided now joined as witnesses to the miracle that had brought them together. As she walked down the aisle, her father's arm steady beside her, the chief whispered, "You sure about this?" She smiled through tears. "For the first time in my life, yes." At the altar, Luke waited, his leather jacket traded for a simple black suit. When their eyes met, the world around them faded. Every fight, every fear, every mile had led to this single, silent truth. They were home. When the ceremony ended, the roar of motorcycles filled the air like applause. Even the chief couldn't help but smile as he watched the angels form a line, revving their engines in salute. "Guess I'll have to get used to that sound," he said. Luke put an arm around his new bride and replied, "That's not noise, sir. That's family." The old man laughed, and for once, he didn't disagree. Life after the wedding didn't turn into a fairy tale. It turned into something far more real. The newlyweds built a small home on the outskirts of town, close enough for her father to visit, but far enough to breathe. Luke opened his own repair shop, hiring a few of the younger bikers who were trying to turn their lives around. He called it Second Chance Garage. The sign was made from an old motorcycle tank and painted by hand. Simple, imperfect, and honest, just like the man who owned it. The Hells Angels, once viewed as outlaws, began to gain the town's cautious respect. They organized charity rides for hospitals and veterans, cleaned roads after storms, and even volunteered to rebuild the playground behind the local school. Children who once hid when they saw them now ran out to wave. For Luke, it was proof that people could change, not just one man, but an entire brotherhood. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about rewriting what came next. The chief became a regular visitor at Second Chance Garage. Sometimes, he came with coffee and conversation. Other times, he brought his officers for repairs and advice. On one of those quiet afternoons, he told Luke, "You did what I couldn't. You made men who were feared become men who are trusted." Luke shook his head. "No, sir. I just showed them what it looks like to be seen." The chief nodded thoughtfully, realizing that sometimes the greatest justice comes not from punishment, but from understanding. One evening, the chief invited Luke and his daughter to dinner. The table that once held anger and silence was now full of laughter and stories. They talked about everything, the past, the road, and the future. For the first time, the chief looked at Luke not as a rival, but as family. "You've made her happy," he said softly, raising his glass. Luke smiled. "She made me human." The moment hung between them like a quiet blessing, unspoken forgiveness sealed over a shared meal. As they left that night, Luke helped the chief to his porch and looked out at the horizon. "You ever think about how strange this is?" he asked. The old man smirked. "Every day." Then his eyes softened. "But I wouldn't trade it for the world." The two men, once enemies, now bound by love and loyalty, stood side by side, watching the last light fade. For the first time, the darkness didn't feel like a threat. It felt like peace. Months later, the world tested that peace once more. A violent storm tore through the county, flooding roads and cutting power for miles. Emergency calls overwhelmed the police. The chief, now older and slower, stayed at the station trying to coordinate help. Luke and his crew, without hesitation, rode straight into the chaos. Rain lashed their faces as they navigated washed-out roads, rescuing stranded families and clearing debris. The Angels didn't wait for orders. They became the lifeline the town needed. In the middle of the storm, the chief received a call. Luke had been injured while saving a trapped driver whose car had been swept into a ditch. Without thinking, the chief jumped into his cruiser and raced through the flooded streets. When he arrived, the headlights cut through sheets of rain, revealing Luke lying on the mud, soaked and bleeding, but alive. The chief ran to his side, shouting for help. Luke, barely conscious, whispered, "Told you. I'd protect what's yours." The words broke the chief. He knelt in the rain, holding the man he once despised. Around them, the Angels stood like silent sentinels, their faces streaked with rain and grief. It was in that moment that the chief finally understood. This wasn't about forgiveness anymore. It was about brotherhood. He looked up at the bikers and said, "Let's get him home." And together, badges and patches, they carried Luke out of the storm. Days later, when Luke awoke in the hospital, the first thing he saw was the chief sleeping in a chair beside him. His daughter sat nearby, her hand wrapped around his. When the old man opened his eyes, Luke whispered, "Did I at least save the car?" The chief laughed through tears. "You saved the whole damn town." The two men grinned at each other, their bond now unbreakable, no longer divided by law or rebellion, but united by love and loyalty carved out of fire and rain. When Luke was finally discharged, the entire town lined the streets to greet him. The roar of motorcycles filled the air once more, echoing through every corner of the city. But this time, it wasn't rebellion, it was celebration. The Hells Angels rode beside the police, their engines thundering in harmony, while children waved and parents cheered. For the first time in living memory, the town didn't see bikers and cops. They saw protectors, different armor, same heart. The storm had changed everything, not just the roads it tore apart, but the hearts it mended. Luke's recovery was slow, but the world outside his hospital window moved differently now. The people who once whispered behind his back now stopped by the garage just to shake his hand. Mothers brought their children to meet the man who had risked his life to save strangers. And even the local news ran a headline that felt like redemption itself. Hell's Angels hero saves town during deadly storm. When he returned to Second Chance Garage, the chief was waiting for him, leaning against a patrol car with a quiet smile. "You've become the talk of the town," he said. Luke chuckled, still moving carefully from his injuries. "Never thought I'd make headlines for something good." The chief handed him a small box. Inside was a police medal, the same kind given to officers for bravery. "You earned it," he said simply. Luke stared at it for a long moment, then shook his head. "No, sir. We earned it." Later that week, the town held a ceremony in the main square. The rain had given way to clear blue skies, and hundreds of people gathered to see what no one could have imagined a year earlier. Bikers and officers standing side by side, united by something stronger than fear. The mayor spoke, the crowd applauded, and when Luke stepped up to the microphone, he didn't give a speech. He just said, "We're not what we wear. We're what we do." And with that, the entire crowd rose in applause that echoed like thunder long after he stepped down. After the ceremony, Luke found the chief, watching quietly from the back of the crowd. "You proud of yourself, old man?" Luke teased. The chief smiled, eyes glistening. "Proud of you," he said. It was simple, but it meant everything. In that single sentence, decades of judgment, anger, and bitterness finally dissolved. They weren't just family by love anymore. They were brothers by choice. That night, the Angels gathered one last time at the edge of town. The bonfire crackled under the stars, casting their faces in gold and shadow. Mason raised a glass and said, "To Luke, and to the man who once called him enemy, but now calls him son." The chief laughed softly, shaking his head. "Careful, Mason, people might start thinking I like you." The men roared with laughter, the sound rolling across the fields like a promise. For once, peace didn't feel fragile. It felt earned. Years passed, but the story lived on. The patch on Luke's jacket faded, the metal on his bike dulled, but his name became a legend. Second Chance Garage turned into more than a business. It became a sanctuary. Young men who had lost their way came there seeking more than work. They came looking for purpose. Luke taught them how to fix engines, but more importantly, how to fix themselves. The same way someone once gave him that chance. The chief eventually retired, but he never drifted far. He spent his mornings at the garage, drinking bad coffee and telling better stories. The townsfolk who saw them together, an ex-cop and a biker side by side, still couldn't quite believe it. But they didn't have to understand it. Some bonds didn't need explaining. They only needed living. One autumn evening, as the sun sank low behind the hills, the chief sat beside Luke on the porch. "Funny," he said, "I used to think the badge was what made me a good man." Luke glanced at him, smiling. "Maybe it wasn't the badge. It was what you protected." The old man nodded slowly. "And you ended up protecting me." They both laughed, a soft, tired kind of laughter that comes only when peace has finally found its place. When the chief passed a few years later, the entire town turned out for his funeral. Police cruisers led the procession, but right behind them came the rumble of 100 motorcycles. The Hells Angels rode slow and silent, their engines humming like a prayer. Luke carried the folded flag to his daughter, his wife, and whispered, "He'll always ride with us." And as the engines roared one last time, even heaven seemed to shake in salute. From that day on, whenever the town heard the distant growl of motorcycles, they didn't think of rebellion. They thought of redemption, of how love had bridged the impossible, of how one biker, one daughter, and one stubborn old cop had rewritten what it meant to protect and to forgive. Because sometimes, the most powerful revolutions aren't fought with weapons, but with hearts brave enough to love beyond the lines the world tries to draw. As the echoes of motorcycle engines faded into the horizon, the story of love, loyalty, and redemption settled into the hearts of those who witnessed it. A father's fear, a daughter's courage, and a biker's unwavering honor had rewritten the rules of a town that once saw only black and white. They had proven that courage isn't measured by the battles you win, but by the walls you tear down to protect those you love. In their journey, everyone saw that love and respect could bridge worlds that seemed impossible to connect. The most remarkable truth of this story is not the danger faced or the obstacles overcome. It is the transformation that happens when people choose understanding over judgment. The Hells Angels showed that loyalty is stronger than fear, and that sometimes the fiercest protection comes from the most unexpected places. The chief learned that forgiveness doesn't weaken a man, it elevates him. And the daughter saw that love, when rooted in integrity and courage, can change not just hearts, but entire communities. Redemption, as this story teaches, is never simple or easy. It is born from risk, from stepping into the unknown, and from trusting that people can be more than their past. It is a journey paved with humility, bravery, and the willingness to rise above anger and prejudice. Every mile ridden, every engine repaired, every hand extended in mercy carried a single message. It is never too late to stand for what is right, to protect those you love, and to honor the bonds that truly matter. When we look at their story, we are reminded that power is not in control or fear. It is in courage, compassion, and loyalty. One daughter, one biker, and one father redefined what it means to protect and forgive. And while motorcycles roared across streets and highways, their sound became more than thunder. It became a hymn of hope, a reminder that love and respect can rise louder than hate and suspicion, no matter how entrenched the world seems. If this story moved you, carry its message forward. Share your thoughts below. Your words might inspire someone to act with courage or forgiveness today. And if you believe in stories that prove the strength of loyalty, love, and redemption, subscribe, like, and stay with us. Together, we can keep these lessons alive, reminding the world that even the most impossible bonds can be mended, and even the hardest hearts can learn to protect what truly matters.